Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we sift through, mountains of industry reports, all the forecasts, insider gossip even, and try to boil it all down. We want to give you the essential, maybe surprising knowledge you need to be, truly informed.
And today, we are really wading into what feels like a crisis point for centralized content creation. We're going to dissect this. The sheer corporate anxiety around potential Hollywood mergers, specifically the big one everyone's talking about, the rumored Warner Brothers sale. Yeah. And we need to connect that anxiety directly to the huge job crisis that's just sweeping through the industry right now.
Yeah, our mission today is pretty focused. We've pulled insights from, financial analysts, labor reporters, studio insiders, people who are basically screaming about impending mass layoffs and this wave of corporate consolidation. But crucially, we're also looking at the response, or maybe the lack of response, from the major labor union. It's surprisingly quiet, almost unnervingly silent. So we want to understand what this Warner Brothers sale, or really any large-scale consolidation, what it signals about the future of traditional studios. And maybe more importantly, what does it mean for the thousands, literally thousands of people who actually work in this industry?
Right. This deep dive is really about connecting those dots. Cause and effect. We need to look at the economic pressures driving these mergers, okay? And then immediately figure out the primary consequence for the workforce. Because, this isn't just shuffling assets on some abstract spreadsheet somewhere. When major companies merge or one acquires another, the biggest and most immediate catalyst for change is mass termination. It's redundancy.
Yeah.
And that fear of redundancy, that's the engine driving so much of the behavior across Hollywood right now.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this then. Let's start with that central financial puzzle, the thing triggering this whole wave of panic. The proposed Warner Brothers sale. So the sources are really pointing to this central tension. It's a proposed Warner Brothers sale. It's apparently dominating every water cooler conversation across LA. And the most often cited scenario, the most likely one people talk about, involves Paramount, potentially working with Skydance maybe, as the main suitor looking to consolidate.
Yeah, that pairing, it makes a certain strategic sense, right? You can see the streaming synergies, how the portfolios might align, but the sheer urgency of this moment, it really feels driven by financial necessity. The concern, and this is pretty much universal consensus in what we read, is that any buyer, even a legacy media company like Paramount, they're going to require deep, painful operational cuts. Some sources are calling it bloodletting, just to make the balance sheet viable for the acquisition.
And we should probably acknowledge the other players too, right? The ones sort of waiting in the wings. There's been significant interest reported from the big tech giants. Apple's name comes up, even traditional cable powerhouses like Comcast. Although, interestingly, the sources we saw mentioned that Netflix, despite having this massive market cap, they reportedly said no. They're not jumping in.
Right.
Apparently preferring to stay focused on their own organic growth rather than, taking on massive debt and all that legacy studio baggage.
And that choice by Netflix, I think that's incredibly insightful because it brings us right to the biggest deterrent in this whole, the debt. Warner Brothers is just saddled with significant debt. Huge amounts. So for anyone interested, this massive financial obligation is a major hurdle.
Why exactly? What does that debt mean practically?
Well, because the debt valuation, it imposes specific growth targets, right? And efficiency demands that fundamentally cannot be met without devastating costs, just met. So when a company like Apple, for example, looks at Warner Brothers, they're not really looking at the thousands of mid-level managers, are they? They're looking at the intellectual property, the IP library, and the distribution channel pipe.
Okay, so it doesn't really matter who the ultimate buyer is then, especially if it's a tech company. Massive job cuts are just baked in. Inevitable.
Absolutely inevitable. When a tech company buys a legacy studio, what are they buying? They're buying the catalog, right? The movies, the shows, and the distribution network. But they are absolutely not buying the redundant infrastructure, all the overlapping administrative staff, accounting, marketing, HR departments.
Duplication.
Exactly. They see all of that as duplication. And those positions, they'll be the first ones eliminated almost instantaneously.
Wow.
And look, to really grasp the terrifying reality of what happens when a sale like this goes through, we don't actually have to wait for the Warner Brothers dust to settle. We can look directly at what's happening at Paramount Skydance right now as they try to quote-unquote right-size themselves, possibly in preparation for this very merger.
Right. It's like a case study in consolidation shock happening in real time. They're already slashing people, as the sources put it, either in anticipation of a merger or maybe just as a consequence of their own internal consolidation efforts already underway. And this corporate term, right size. That sounds so benign, doesn't it?
Yeah, very clinical.
But what it means, in practical terms, is executing a devastating reduction in force, all aimed at making the resulting company more palatable or maybe just cheaper for acquisition.
And this isn't just theory. We have specific figures cited in the material we looked at. The initial volley of layoffs, the first wave, was expected to hit roughly 1,000 staffers. But internal planning apparently showed a total of around 2,000 positions slated for termination in a single week.
2,000 jobs in 1 week.
And this process, it's expected to be continuous. It'll target various divisions until they hit whatever size.
Wow. And the cynical reading here, maybe not cynical, maybe just financially logical, which certainly seems backed up by the source material, is that Paramount is actively trying to free up cash, streamline its operations, get the company down to an efficient core so that they can then step up and buy Warner Brothers.
Precisely.
And once they do that, they'll just start the whole rinse and repeat cycle of layoffs over WB, eliminating all the duplicative layers of their operation. It sounds like an acquisition strategy built entirely on forced redundancy.
It is. And that forced redundancy, it targets specific areas. The sources really emphasize that the cuts are heaviest in those duplicative middle management layers.
Right.
And also in specific production teams, particularly maybe those focused on streaming content that hasn't hit whatever high performance metrics they've set.
Like overlapping marketing teams.
Exactly. Or two separate finance departments handling the exact same IP rights once the companies merge. Why keep both? But the most specific, and I have to say genuinely shocking, is the internal language reported by Insight. Management has reportedly told division heads across all their major entities, include CBS, CBS News, Paramount Plus Theme, MTV, Nickelodeon, Rich, to compile what are explicitly being referred to internally as kill
lists. Seriously, that's the actual term being used.
That's the term reported by internal sources, used by executives themselves.
Wow. That specific terminology, kill lists. It just speaks to a level of, corporate disassociation that's genuinely terrifying. This isn't just restructuring, is it? It's a planned, deliberate bloodbath designed to wipe out duplication ahead of a massive financial transaction.
Yeah. And the broader implication here, it's historical, right? This isn't new exactly. Mergers always lead to job loss. Our sources cite Disney's massive acquisition of Fox as a prime historical example. Analysts back then predicted something like up to 70% overlap in non-creative sectors like marketing.
But the scale and maybe more importantly, the velocity of the cuts happening now. It feels radically accelerated. It feels faster, harsher, probably fueled by the immediate demands of the streaming market and, of course, the high debt load of the companies involved.
Okay, so if the cuts are inevitable and the velocity is frankly terrifying, the next logical question we had to ask looking at the sources was, where is the labor risk? Because the silence from the major players, the unions, it's been deafening.
Yeah, and that brings us neatly into Section 2 and what the source material describes as a truly perplexing dynamic. Despite this imminent threat, thousands of jobs potentially lost, affecting every single corner of the industry. The major Hollywood unions, we're talking the Actors Union, SAG-AFTRA, the Directors Guild, DGA, and the big crew union, IATSE, they have been, as the source puts it, suspiciously quiet. And that quietness, it's absolutely contrary to how they usually behave. Historically, these organizations are typically really loud about corporate shifts, especially shifts that threaten the working class of Hollywood. They demand better terms. They express concerns about market concentration. Generally, they're the ones raising the alarm bells.
Loudly. But there is one very notable and very loud exception here. The Writers Guild of America, the WGA.
Okay. The WGA has spoken up.
Oh, yeah. The sources confirm the WGA has weighed in and strongly. They're threatening to fight tooth and nail, that's their phrase, against this potential Skydance Paramount Warner Brothers merger. They explicitly called the prospect a disaster for writers, for consumers, and for companies.
Okay, so the WGA is fighting, but the others, SAG-AFTRA, DGA, IATSE, they're laying strikingly low. We need to understand why. What's the reason? The sources offer some compelling, maybe dark reasons, centered on fear, maybe, and the consequences of past actions.
Exactly. I think there are a few layers here. The first layer is probably simple fear of immediate backlash, retaliation. Unions might be choosing to, keep their mouths shut, as one source put it, to avoid ticking off the studios and maybe protect the few remaining high-value jobs they still have strong bargaining power over. If you speak out against a multi-billion-dollar merger, you potentially become a political liability, right?
Right.
And studios have shown they're increasingly willing to just pack up and move production to states or countries with fewer union requirements.
Okay, that makes sense. But you mentioned past actions. What's the deeper reason?
Well, the deeper, maybe more profound reason relates to the fallout from the recent double strikes. Remember the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes?
Yeah, of course. Very recent history.
The sources we looked at indicate, and they cite reports from places like the New York Times, that those strikes, in terms of long-term economic leverage, kind of backfired. Hollywood has not, according to the reporting, recovered the jobs lost during those strikes. The jobs haven't come back in the same numbers.
So the strikes weakened their position. paradoxically.
That's the crucial analysis coming through. The bargaining power the unions thought they had. Maybe it dissolved or at least diminished. When the studios realized they could actually survive prolonged shutdowns, maybe better than expected, things like generative AI emerging, the flexibility of non-union production outside California, it sort of changed the equation. The studios adapted, maybe faster than the unions anticipated. And furthermore, the sheer financial cost of the strike. It depleted union reserves, sure, but critically, it drained the savings of their actual members. People were hurting.
Okay, so this silence we're seeing now, it's not apathy. It's more like a strategic retreat, based on a realization that the power dynamic has fundamentally shifted.
I think that's exactly it. The unions are operating under this grim realization that job shrinkage is inevitable, regardless of whether they speak up or not. They know that if there are simply fewer jobs to go around, the last thing their leadership wants is to ruin their chances of securing those for their members. Or, creating bad rapport with studios that are already looking for any excuse to move production entirely or hire non-union workers.
So staying quiet is seen as maybe preserving some kind of working relationship to the future, even if it means sacrificing a public fight right now.
What's fascinating here is that shift in perceived leverage. Look at the directors, the DGA. They generally represent the least impacted segment, right? The high-earning, highly mobile, above-the-line talent, particularly silent. They know their specialized work is harder to replace, sure, but they also know that if production stops altogether, they don't get paid either.
And for the crew, IATs.
For IAT, the situation is even more precarious. Their jobs are the most geographically flexible. If they protest loudly, the studios can just move filming to Georgia or New Mexico or wherever, much more easily than they can replace a star actor, for instance. It's easier to find non-union.
So the consensus from the source material seems to be that this is a moment of really severe realism for organized labor. And they recognize their historic centralized power is diminished. And speaking out when the outcome, mass job loss, seems guaranteed anyway, might simply guarantee that their own members are the first ones on those dreaded corporate kill list.
Exactly. Silence is being framed, at least implicitly, as the lesser of two. It's prioritizing the preservation of some kind of working relationship over what might be seen as a purely symbolic protest with a predetermined negative outcome.
Okay, so this strategic silence, born out of this diminished power, it leads us into a deeper exploration of the unions themselves. And this paradox, really, of the role they play in modern Hollywood, at least as described in the sources we looked at.
Right. And we have to start with their acknowledged original, which, let's be clear, remains fundamentally necessary. The sources are very clear on Hollywood studios would love for them to be gone, period.
No doubt.
The unions exist to enforce standardized contracts, ensure better pay, maintain safety regulations, which is critical, life-saving stuff on set, and crucially, guarantee residuals.
Residuals point feels, especially now, streaming and
It's arguably the most important element of their historical function, and maybe their current one too. Without unions, the sources argue the studios would try to do really underhanded, shitty things, to direct quote, basically, like securing perpetual likeness rights or voice rights for just a one-time fee, completely eliminating any future payment for the actor or writer whose work continues to generate billions for decades. So yeah, their core function is essential for anyone trying to build a sustainable...
Okay, so the necessity is there, but the sources also contain some pretty powerful critiques, right? This contention that unions have, maybe in modern times, overstepped or destroyed their credibility and become perceived, at least by a substantial portion of the industry, as the bullies.
Yeah, that critique is definitely present in the material, and it shifts the discussion towards the core financial structure of, and this pretty provocative contention that they operate almost like a form of, protection.
Protection money. Explain that.
The argument being made by some people interviewed in the sources is that unions have become like a cog in the wheel of extortion. The dynamic is described as pretty brutal. You must pay dues to be allowed to work on most major projects. Membership is mandatory. But, and this is the kicker, that payment offers absolutely no guarantee of getting a job. None.
So you're paying just for the chance to work?
You're paying for the honor of being allowed to audition, maybe? Or the chance to accept a gig if one comes along under specific union terms. You pay to be in the club, essentially. Right. And this dynamic, it only gets magnified when you look at the financial reality for the vast, vast majority of union. We pulled a genuinely shocking directly from our that really underscores this imbalance. Apparently only 2% of dues-paying actors in Hollywood reportedly make enough money to actually sustain themselves full-time from acting, or even enough to qualify for and cover the costs of the union-provided health insurance.
Wait, only 2% make a living wage or qualify for health?
2%, according to the reporting we saw.
And that means 98% of the membership are paying into a system that doesn't provide them with a sustainable income.
Yeah.
That's an astronomical financial disparity. It raises profound questions about, like, who the union leadership is really accountable.
Well, the implication is subtle, but it's powerful. Why do 98% of ACT pay hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars in dues every year for this minuscule chance of employment? The sources suggest they're desperate for the chance to get on the Hollywood ride, as one person put it, even if they rarely.
They pay for the dream, essentially.
We pay for the opportunity, yeah. And maybe more critically, they pay because without that union card, they're completely locked out of almost all major studio productions entirely. So this creates effectively a captive audience for dues collectors.
And that massive base, the 98% who aren't working consistently but are paying dues, that gives the union leadership immense political capital and financial stability, right?
Yeah.
Even when the job market shrinks like it is now.
Exactly. The leadership, arguably, answers primarily to the core 2% who are working, because the other 98%, they have no realistic option but to keep paying and remain members if they want any shot at all, which maintains the union's revenue stream regardless of how poor the overall employment statistics actually are for the membership.
Okay, so given this, let's call it a dire financial reality for both non-working members and maybe the union structure itself, we can see why they might be attempting this radical pivot for survival, right, in this shrinking job market. The traditional revenue stream from high-volume, centralized production, it's drying up as production moves out of California and traditional studio jobs just vanish.
Yeah. Absolutely. So the unions are now trying to cast a wider net, as the sources describe it. They're actively trying to recruit independent digital content creators, YouTubers, Twitch streamers, podcasters, trying to get them to join the union and pay dues.
They want to replace the lost revenue from film and TV production with fees from the creator economy.
That seems to be the strategy. Replace the old revenue with the new. Now, this strategy is viewed by some in the sources as, well, pretty desperate. A grip, according to some critic. They believe it's ultimately unsustainable. The pitch is basically, come join us, be part of Hollywood too, we'll offer you protection. But the critics argue the unions are just trying to absorb new dues without being able to provide commensurate job security or actual work opportunities in return. I mean, these creators are already self-employed entrepreneurs, right?
Right. It's a totally different model. So this move really signals a fundamental recognition of the financial crisis the unions themselves are facing. They see content creation migrating away from the centralized studio system, and they're scrambling to follow the money, even if it means trying to unionize a workforce, the independent creator style. That is fundamentally accustomed to independence, non-standardized pay, and zero reliance on traditional guild structures. It feels like a clash waiting to happen.
Yeah, and if the unions are struggling to hold on to their relevance in Los Angeles, it's partly because the physical industry itself is undergoing this major geographical shift, and that shift is fundamentally eroding their traditional base of power.
It just comes down to basic economics, doesn't it? It's just too expensive to produce everything centrally in California anymore. You've got high labor costs, expensive permits. The cost of real estate is insane. It means the whole industry is just inexorably moving toward decentralized production out of necessity.
Yeah.
They're chasing tax incentives.
Exactly. We're seeing massive production movement. You hear about it all the time. Places like Georgia, New Mexico, Louisiana, they're booming. And increasingly international locations too. Canada, the UK, Eastern Europe, places that offer substantial financial incentives and, crucially, often operate with a much weaker union presence or sometimes entirely non-union. And that is just gutting the local entertainment economy back in Los Angeles.
And California's response to this exit, it's kind of telling, isn't it? The state is offering bigger and bigger tax credits. It feels almost desperate, put it. A desperate attempt to keep studios filming in LA. But as one analyst pointed out, if a major studio like Warner Brothers is gone, maybe it's merged into Paramount, maybe it's acquired by a tech giant that doesn't care where it films, that's potentially one less major applicant for those state credits, right? Which kind of renders the state's efforts less effective because the whole incentive structure assumes major studios want to stay put.
Yeah, the ground is shifting under their... The final assessment here, kind of uniting all these threads, seems pretty clear. You combine the costly centralized production model, these aggressive corporate mergers that eliminate headquarters staff anyway, and the financial necessity of decentralization. It really does suggest a definitive end of Hollywood, as we've known. That whole idea of Hollywood being this single, centralized, geographic next-higher global and collapsing under its own weight bent.
Okay, so if the studios are losing their geographic hold, they seem to be simultaneously losing their audience hold, which is arguably even more concerning for their actual business model. Let's shift focus to audience behavior now and the streaming dynamics. You mentioned the Tubi anecdote from our source material. Tell us about that.
Right, Tubi. It's the free ad-supported streaming service owned by Fox now. The source highlights this genuinely surprising fact that Tubi is reportedly doing better with certain legacy intellectual property, specifically Looney Tunes, than Warner Brothers itself was doing with the exact same property on its own premium subscription service, Max.
Wait, Looney Tunes does better on free Tubi than paid Max?
Apparently so. We know that Looney Tunes is now consistently listed as one of Tubi's top 10 most-watched shows regularly.
That's astonishing. Looney Tunes, it's like the cornerstone of the Warner Brothers legacy. Yet it performs better when it's free on some third-party ad-supported platform. What does that suggest about how people are watching things now?
Well, it suggests a pretty fundamental shift in consumer behavior, doesn't it? As the global economy tightens, maybe people are just getting tired of juggling multiple expensive subscriptions, that whole subscription stacking fatigue. And they're migrating away from that, choosing instead what's readily available and free, even with ads.
So they'll take the ads to get the content for free.
It seems so. And the implication for the traditional studios, it's devastating. It means the studio system is fundamentally failing to monetize, even capitalize on its own foundational IP, its legacy assets. Why would you subscribe to Max if the content you actually want, like Looney Tunes, is available for free with ads somewhere else?
Yeah.
The sources compared this to an unthinkable scenario, like Disney basically abandoning Mickey Mouse, letting him run primarily on a competitor's free platform.
Yeah.
When the perceived value of your own legacy content is actually higher on a free external platform than on your own premium one, you have a catastrophic business model failure on your hands.
And this failure, it isn't just about consumer choices. It feels like a strategic error, too. Maybe Mac, in its constant rebranding and chasing the next big hit, maybe it just failed to adequately market its own deep library, neglected the foundational IP that built the company in the first place.
Failed to understand the value of their own basement, essentially.
Yeah.
They were so focused on the new shiny thing, they forgot the gold they already had. And as if, all these economic pressures, the job losses, the audience migration, as if that weren't enough. These massive corporate maneuvers, they're also deeply influenced by, and in turn immediately influence, high-level political forces, which just adds another layer of complexity to this whole mess.
Right. We have to touch on the political context mentioned in the source, specifically regarding that rumored Paramount WB merger. The sources cite claims, and we should stress these are claims reported in the sources, that former President Trump is reportedly pushing for the Paramount, apparently driven by the close relationship between the Ellison family, who control Skydance and have a big stake in Paramount, and Trump himself.
Yeah, those political motivations are. But regardless of why it might be happening, the consolidation itself has immediate, tangible, real-world media consequences that go far beyond just making movies. The source points out a crucial regulatory hurdle. If Paramount does acquire Warner Brothers, the resulting combined entity cannot legally keep both CBS News and CNN. Because of existing media concentration rules set by regulators like you can't own that many major news outlets.
Okay, so that forces a choice. This merged company would either have to sell CNN, which is part of the Warner Brothers portfolio, or potentially merge CNN wholesale with CBS News. Wow, that just illustrates how this high-level corporate consolidation, it's not just an industry issue confined to Hollywood Boulevard, is it? It's often influenced by these external political dynamics, and it has immediate, non-negotiable implications for the entire national media landscape, especially major news organizations.
Absolutely. It ripples outward significantly. Okay. Let's switch gears slightly to what seems like the necessary survival strategy, the digital pivot. Let's look at how traditional studios are, frankly, struggling to bridge this enormous cultural and economic gap with the booming creator economy. Because this is the new content landscape where they desperately hope to find new audiences, new revenue streams. And we can look specifically at Disney here. They've been trying this in various forms for decades now.
Right. Disney has this long and often very expensive history of struggling to really understand, let alone effectively acquire or integrate the digital space.
Yeah.
We know about their attempts way back to try and co-opt YouTube, like buying that multi-channel network Maker Studios years ago.
Yeah, Maker, that was a huge deal at the time.
Huge deal. They thought they could just purchase the infrastructure that managed big creators like PewDiePie. But that massive effort largely failed, didn't it? Because they couldn't really manage these independent creator personalities within their rigid corporate framework. The cultures clashed.
Massively. So their current strategy seems less about acquisition now, more about collaboration. They're leveraging massive creators, Mr. Beast being the prime example, using him for promotional activity, campaigns for big movies like Tron, or for major PR stunts like those Make-A-Wish events. And this is largely seen by observers in the sources as this concerted, very expensive attempt to buy their way into YouTube. To kind of borrow the authenticity of these creators to market traditional Hollywood IP to a younger digital native audience.
But does it work? What's the critical analysis here? Our sources seem to question the ultimate effectiveness of this approach, right? While these campaigns generate enormous views, absolute staggering numbers, does simply hiring a massive creator for promotion guarantee real commercial success for Disney?
Well, the argument is that legitimate popularity in the digital space, it doesn't automatically translate into real-world scalable consumer sales for the legacy brand. The source notes the lack, for instance, of widespread dominant consumer sales success for Mr. Beast's own chocolate bars or burgers. You can get the clicks, you can get the views, but that doesn't always equal sustainable high-margin revenue growth for the traditional studio system that's paying for the promotion. It's a different kind of engagement.
Okay. Which kind of brings us full circle, doesn't it? Traditional Hollywood is bleeding jobs, struggling to make money off its own core IP, facing this unavoidable consolidation driven by crippling debt. And critically, it seems to be failing to effectively integrate into the new digital economy that is already replacing it, the primary engine of creative content.
Yeah. The old model is definitely collapsed. And the new model, they haven't really figured out how to cap it. They're kind of clumsy. So if we try and connect this entire analysis, tie it all together, we see a clear and frankly undeniable trajectory. You have inevitable mass layoffs colliding head-on, silent, a weakened, and this dual pressure is forced higher rapid geography, literally moving out of California, and aggressive towards a space where, as we just discussed, they are currently poor, clumsy, and often ineffective. Traditional Hollywood, and they're facing existential crisis all the time. The era of the centralized, all-powerful, the one that dictated culture and economics, a century.
And this leaves us with a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider as you process this deep dive. If the major studio unions, SAG-AFTRA, IAC, DGA, if they do successfully pivot, if they manage to incorporate thousands of these independent digital creators, the YouTubers, the podcast creators who currently operate almost entirely outside the traditional system, will that move actually empower the union? Will it significantly boost their numbers and compensate for the lost revenue from film and TV? Or could it simply accelerate their own demise?
It's a huge question, because by absorbing a workforce that is just fundamentally accustomed to radical independence, to non-unionized, to being self-employed entrepreneurs, the unions risk introducing this potentially unsustainable collision of two radically different economic models, two different cultures right under one tent. The creators, they generally want autonomy, flexibility, no fixed rules. The unions, by their very nature, demand standardization, contracts, dues.
So how does that unavoidable conflict resolve itself? Will the creators end up, in effect, unionizing Hollywood in their image? Or will Hollywood's traditional unions collapse while attempting to manage this fundamentally different type of creator? The answer to that, well, it will likely define the next decade of the entire entertainment industry. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.